YouTube. My name is Jack. Today we're going to talk about philosophy, magic, mysticism, and the ways that those things overlap and are separate from each other. This is a thing that I think about a lot because in my day job I am an academic philosopher. Philosophy is my bread and butter. And yet, I am also a mystic, I am a witch, I am an occultist and magical practitioner, and those things don't really go hand in hand with academic philosophy, or at least with contemporary Anglo-American academic philosophy. Um, when I'm talking to people in the woo world, when I'm talking to witches or magical practitioners or tarot readers, and they find out that I am a philosopher, a lot of the time this is something that seems to make a great deal of sense to them. And they say something to the effect of, oh, how does your philosophy inform your witchcraft? Or vice versa, how does your witchcraft inform your philosophy? And a lot of the time people are quite surprised when I say, it really doesn't. I work in academic philosophy. I work on the history of philosophy, specializing in 18th century German philosophy of science. My research is about the question of how we can have knowledge of causal relations in the world according to people who were doing research at a time before Einstein when all of the physics was classical Newtonian mechanics. Very, very different from witchcraft. Not a lot of overlap there. And more broadly, uh, a lot of academic philosophy isn't mystical, isn't magical in flavor. It tends to be uh, very focused on pushing propositions around in the right way, building arguments in the right way, according to a set of formal conventions that have been developed over the course of a couple of hundred years, but really especially the past 100 years or so. And philosophers like to focus in on very narrow questions, often with a great deal of technical background to them, and ask things like, given mathematical Platonism about numbers, so uh, Platonism is, broadly speaking, the philosophical view that there exist abstract entities, things that aren't physical, but that are somehow universal, such as numbers or colors. People get excited when they hear about the existence of non-physical entities and they think that it's talking about spirits or ghosts or gods, and it's really not, at least not in the context that you find it in contemporary philosophical discourse. It's things like numbers. Does the number 5 exist? So given mathematical Platonism, do certain other views fall out of that given the constraints that we have on the way that we reason? It's very rigorous and dry. And I enjoy that kind of discourse a lot of the time, but it's not sparkly or mystical or magical in a way that I think a lot of people, if you haven't been exposed to academic philosophy, you assume that philosophers spend a lot of time pondering the mysteries of the universe and the meaning of life and this and that. And in reality, it's much more a matter of if I take a non-cognitivist view about meta-ethics, is it possible to solve the Frege-Geach problem? Um, it's not the mystery of it all. It's very specific, rigorously shaped arguments that are following a particular set of conventions about reasoning. And even in domains of philosophy like philosophy of religion, those conventions are really important in shaping not only the way that people talk, but the things that people talk about. So partly because of the trajectory of the history of thought in Western Europe, a lot of philosophy of religion tacitly assumes a kind of monotheism. Philosophy of religion, if you talk to people about proofs for or against the existence of God, they're assuming a monotheistic deity who is not exactly the same as the Christian deity, but there's a Christian influence here that goes unquestioned, right? The figure that usually gets talked about is something called the god of the philosophers, which is a deity that is taken to be a wholly necessary being, a being that like must exist with a kind of modal force that doesn't apply to you or me. I could possibly have not existed, but the god of the philosophers is meant to be an entity that has to have existed. And the god of the philosophers is usually also taken to be uh, perfect in this kind of Platonic sense of the word. So omnipresent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent, right? The idea of a god that knows everything, can do everything, and is fundamentally morally good. Like that's roughly the idea of the god of the philosophers that you'll find in academic philosophical discourse, which of course just leaves out large swaths of religious practice and religious experience, right? It doesn't make room not only for polytheism, but also for just like, I don't know, like there's a very particular impersonal sense of deity that you find with the god of the philosophers, which is not reflective of a lot of religious experience, not only in paganism, but also even in like Christianity, right? Where people think of God as being a personal savior. And the idea of salvation, of heaven and hell, those things typically fall by the wayside in philosophical discussions about religion. So philosophy is this very strange animal, and it's a unique animal. And I think people who are outside of philosophy often aren't familiar with what that looks like, and think that philosophy is just sort of a sense of wonder about the universe, which would lend itself very naturally to a magical or mystical practice. In fact, philosophy is pretty hostile to magic and mysticism, which is okay, right? Most of academia is. And there's a reason that my research is not on the philosophy of magic, it's on the philosophy of 18th century German metaphysics. Um, but, you know, that puts me in an interesting position as someone who uh, does magic and does mysticism and takes those things seriously. Because I also have this philosopher brain that is always running in the background and that wants to see a structure behind things, wants to organize my beliefs in a way that feels not only internally coherent, but also consistent with all of the information that I have, all of the empirical evidence that I have. Um, and you know that's sometimes an interesting position to be in. Circle back to that point. Um, I've talked about philosophy. Magic, as I'm using it here, broadly, I mean the attempt to exercise change in the world, either through laws of sympathy, like what's mentioned in James Fraser's Golden Bough, or through the intervention of incorporeal spirits. So you summon an angel and ask the angel to help you, whatever, get a job or so on. And then mysticism is what I mean when I say mysticism in this context is a direct and experiential approach to the divine, often with a tinge of ecstasy to it. So it's ecstatic and experiential, and it puts you in connection with the divine, usually in a way that ends up with people saying some version of like, we are all one, the boundaries between my ego and yours are an illusion, where, you know, like, it ends up with this kind of non-dualism. That's not always something that falls out of mysticism, so I don't mean to imply that that's like a necessary feature of mysticism, but a lot of mysticism ends up being non-dual. And it's very, like, it's irrational, not in the sense that it's, like, bad or wrong or we shouldn't do it or think it, but it's irrational in the sense that it's not making an appeal to the rational mind. Mysticism makes an appeal to ecstatic religious experience in a way that often cannot be put into words, right? It is a mystery. And therefore, it's very much at odds with philosophy, which is all about putting things into words. Philosophy is fundamentally the attempt to achieve truth through the exercise of reason. That's what philosophy is. And mysticism is the attempt to suspend the conscious mind in order to achieve a deeper truth that is inaccessible to reason. Those two things don't go together. And as people, you can do both of them. I do both of them. But you can't really be doing them both at the same time and in the same way. There is no way to be doing an ecstatic witch ritual as a philosopher, and there is no way to do philosophy as a witch, because my witchcraft is so much informed by those irrational personal experiences. Now, that's not to say that, like, I think the whole thing is irrational and I should throw critical thinking out the window. Because again, like, I want to organize my beliefs and my practices in a way that's coherent, both with itself and with what I know of the outside world. And so I'm not going to, believe that my magic can do things that are physically impossible. I'm not going to, go around saying that I can raise the dead or that know fundamental truths about the like structure of reality that were revealed to me in a dream. Like weirdly, that doesn't fly with philosophers. Um, but at the same time, part of what I consider admissible evidence when I'm taking into account what I know of the world and trying to form a worldview that's consistent with that, part of what I consider admissible evidence for that is that ecstatic, direct personal experience of the divine, which is not rational in nature and therefore isn't admissible evidence in a philosophical court of law. So, holistically, my view of the world is not entirely philosophical because I want to take into account things that I think philosophy, by its nature, doesn't want to touch. Right? Philosophy doesn't want to talk about mysticism. Philosophy doesn't want to engage with that because philosophy wants the things that we can reason about. And the fundamental premise of mysticism is that at least some truths are only accessible in a non-reasoned way. So I have philosophy over here, I have mysticism over here, and then there's magic sitting kind of in between the two. On the one hand, magic is obviously experiential. Uh, right, I believe in magic, and I do. I wholeheartedly believe in magic. But I believe in magic because I have had direct personal experiences with performing spells and getting results in a way that, on the one hand, is empirical, right? I have made observations and drawn conclusions based on that. But also, I have drawn those conclusions based on observations that were not made in a rigorous experimental setting. Um, right, like I didn't do a double-blind study of a statistically significant number of people who, all performed a spell and half of them performed the real spell and half of them performed a placebo version of the spell, and, we conducted statistical analysis to see how effective the spell was. Like, none of that has happened. It's all anecdotal evidence. And moreover, there's a sense, I think, with magic, I at least feel this way, and I think probably a lot of magical practitioners do. There's a sense with magic that something about it is inherently that sort of wordless, irrational, experiential thing, where, like, like the fog would dissipate if you tried to put it under a spotlight, right? There is something about the nature of magic that lends itself to not just secrecy, but privacy and to like personal experience in a way that doesn't hold up well under the light of like experimental rigor. And that's not to say that it's fake, it's just that like magic is in some ways more of an art than a science, right? I consider magic something that can achieve practical results, but it's not, to me at least, and this partly has to do with the traditions that I belong to and the ways in which I practice magic. There are lots of different approaches to magic, some of which are very like process oriented and really are like, if you do this thing in this way and say this thing at this time on this day, you will get this result. The kind of magic that I do is more ecstatic, more connected into that mysticism. And it's at least partly about a feeling, about achieving a sense of transcendence in which it seems that anything is possible. And when you can get yourself there, it's very easy to just sort of stick your thumb on the scales of fortune and get things to swing the way that you want or need them to go. Um, that's something that you can't just do with the philosophy brain, right? You need the mysticism, you need the irrational, experiential, ecstatic aspect of things to do magic, at least in that way. There are certain models of astrological magic or potentially grimoire magic, certain kinds of grimoire magic, that might not require that. I am less versed in those kinds of magic, so I can't speak as much to how well they would jive with a wholly philosophical worldview that didn't include mysticism. A lot of grimoire magic, at least, really includes the communication, like direct communication with incorporeal spirits, in a way that strikes me as relying on at least a little bit of mysticism, but I could be wrong about that. Certainly, a lot of like uh, magicians working in the late medieval and early modern periods thought of themselves as philosophers and were trying to approach that subject matter with a kind of philosophical rigor. I have complaints about their philosophical systems. I think they're actually pretty internally inconsistent because, again, I don't think that magic holds up to the kind of pure rationalism that philosophy requires. And in particular, like a lot of these people were Aristotelians who were also trying to introduce the existence of incorporeal spirits, which is something that Aristotle would absolutely not have allowed. But that's like that is inside baseball. That's a gripe that I have with mostly scholastic philosophy. Like that's not really a concern here. But the point is, like, magic, at least the magic that I do, and I don't speak for all of magic. Magic requires a little bit of that mysticism. You have to get yourself into that mystical sort of dissolved place in order even to feel like magic is possible. But you also don't, again, you don't want to abandon critical thinking altogether when you're doing magic. You want to observe your magic and say, did this work? Did it not work? If it didn't work, do I think that it didn't work because I did something wrong? Do I think that it didn't work because something else interfered? Or do I think that it didn't work because magic is bullshit and doesn't work? And like, I think it is actually important at times to keep that one on the table as an option, to be willing to ask yourself, to be willing to have that doubt. Is magic just fake? Is it bullshit? Um, I, I am a philosopher. I want to form well-founded beliefs. And I don't want to just decide that I'm going to believe in magic and be dogmatic about it and never allow myself to question that and end up wandering off into delusion in a way. Like, this is the thing that happens with a lot of conspirituality, where people commit themselves to a belief and then refuse to critically reevaluate that belief at any stage. And once you've done that once, it becomes easy to do that again and easy to do that again. And then next thing you know, you're perpetuating like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and you're just falling down a QAnon rabbit hole. And like, it's bad, but it happens to a lot of people. Because when we do magic, there is this weird rub of, on the one hand, we are doing something that requires a certain kind of irrationality. Irrationality, again, not in the sense of being stupid or bad or not making sense, but irrationality in the sense that we are engaging with something that is fundamentally not of the rational mind, and we have to be willing to engage with it with something else, at least in addition to the rational mind. But at the same time, we don't want to lose our capacity for reason altogether. So I don't know. These are just some thoughts that have been milling around in my brain. This video was largely inspired. Like, I was going to make this video at some point, but specifically I decided to sit down and make it tonight because of a fantastic video by Benebell Wen about the relationship between philosophy and divination in the I Ching. So I will link that video down below. Benebell is fantastic. She also has a new translation and commentary on the I Ching that is coming out this month. I'm super excited for it. So if you are interested in the I Ching or in Confucian or esoteric Taoist philosophy and you want to learn more about that, I really highly recommend Benebell's work. She also has a couple of other books, and she has a ton of content that's available for free on her website, on her YouTube channel, and so on. So go check her out. She's incredible. But just like watching through her video made me think about the relationship between philosophy, mysticism, and magic in the context of my own practice and the traditions that I belong to. And I thought I would sit down and share. So thank you for watching. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I will catch up with you sometime soon. Bye.